The teacher snatched the mic mid-sentence, her voice sharp. "This isn't your kind of competition, Ariel." Gasps rippled through the auditorium as the black student stood frozen, her final words still unspoken. Her slides wiped from the screen. Cameras flashed. The judges looked away. And from the back row, someone slipped a folded note onto her chair. "Drop out, or we'll make you disappear." Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Ariel Monroe entered the hallway with the kind of determined stride that came from years of learning to make herself seen in spaces that preferred she remain invisible. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of Eastwood High, reflecting against trophy cases filled almost entirely with the names and faces of students who looked nothing like her. She paused briefly, scanning the polished plaques that stretched along the wall, each representing a year in which the Future Leaders debate competition had crowned yet another privileged student from the same predictable group. The school celebrated these winners as proof of excellence, yet the real tradition was something unspoken. Only those who fit a certain mold ever seemed to rise to the top. Ariel had known this since freshman year, but this time she refused to let that silent rule dictate her fate. Her notebook was clutched tightly to her chest as she approached room 214, the debate office where sign-ups were posted. Inside, students milled around, some reviewing index cards, others exchanging confident, rehearsed smiles. But the moment Ariel stepped over the threshold, the air shifted, conversations softened, eyes slid over her with that same familiar mixture of curiosity and dismissal, the kind that suggested she was merely visiting a space she did not naturally belong to. She kept her chin high, refusing to shrink, even as the temperature in the room felt colder than the hallway. At the far end sat Mrs. Karen Holloway, perched behind her desk like a gatekeeper guarding the path to opportunity. Her posture was composed, her expression faintly amused, and her eyes sharpened the moment they landed on Ariel. The woman had taught at Eastwood High for over 20 years, long enough to develop the kind of reputation people didn't speak about loudly, but understood implicitly. Students like Ariel rarely earned her enthusiasm. Holloway tended to elevate the ones whose families had clout in the district, the ones whose names already buzzed through the PTA brunches before any competition began. She liked students who mirrored the world she was comfortable in, and that world had never included someone like Ariel Monroe. A soft, dismissive smirk curled at the edge of Karen Holloway's lips as she watched the black girl step forward to sign her name. It wasn't blatant enough to be called out in front of the others, but there was no mistaking its meaning. Even from across the room, Ariel felt that subtle sting, the quiet assertion that she was overstepping. Her hand trembled only slightly as she wrote her name on the sign-up sheet, but she steadied herself, refusing to let that silent mockery break through the confidence she brought with her that morning. She had learned long ago that the most potent forms of exclusion were the ones delivered without words. As Ariel moved aside, she caught a glimpse of Karen lowering her gaze and leaning back with a condescending amusement. The teacher's thoughts were nearly visible in her expression, an unspoken message that Ariel's ambition was not only unrealistic but disruptive. For a split second, Ariel felt the familiar heat of humiliation crawl through her chest, the kind that came from being evaluated not on merit, but on assumptions tied to the color of her skin. Yet she refused to let that feeling sit. She reminded herself that her presence alone challenged expectations, and that was precisely why she needed to stay. What she did not see was the quiet exchange of glances among a few students clustered near the front. Their faces showed surprise, annoyance, and the faintest trace of anticipation, as though they already knew the outcome of a game she had just entered without understanding all the hidden rules. Eastwood High had its own hierarchy, and the competition served as a stage where that hierarchy was reinforced. Ariel's name on the list disrupted a pattern that some students had been groomed to believe was theirs to inherit. After the sign-up window closed, Karen Holloway rose from her desk and began addressing the room with the polished authority of someone who believed deeply in the power of her role. She praised the dedication of her top-performing students, particularly highlighting those from families who had long-standing ties to the school. Though she spoke in measured tones, her eyes never strayed toward Ariel. It was as if Ariel's name on the list was an inconvenience. Karen intended to handle quietly, perhaps hoping the girl would become overwhelmed and withdraw voluntarily. But Ariel noticed the subtle shift in the classroom's energy. She noticed how Karen lingered proudly on names she favored, how her voice softened with approval only for certain students, how her shoulders relaxed whenever she looked away from Ariel. It was as clear as the tension in Ariel's chest. This competition was not designed for her success. Still, she took her seat among the others, refusing to yield the space she had rightfully earned. She reviewed her notes, steadying her breathing as she mentally prepared for what lay ahead. Ariel had faced prejudice before. She knew its patterns, recognized its tendencies, and understood its ability to mask itself beneath professional decorum. What she didn't yet realize was that this competition would be unlike anything she had encountered. It wouldn't simply be a matter of outperforming her classmates. It would be a matter of dismantling obstacles deliberately placed before her. Karen began explaining the competition structure, outlining familiar rules and judging criteria. Yet something in her tone hinted at a shift, the kind that signaled she wasn't merely updating students. She was preparing to shape the competition around her biases. Ariel felt it in the way Karen's eyes flickered briefly toward her, assessing, calculating. It was almost as though the teacher had already predicted that Ariel's presence would complicate the expected outcome, and was now considering her next move. The morning progressed, and students dispersed to gather materials. But Karen stayed behind, hovering near the sign-up sheet. With a contemplative expression, her fingers traced over the names, stalling momentarily. When they touched Ariel's, her smirk returned, sharper than before. She seemed to take a quiet pleasure in imagining how she might reassert the hierarchy that Ariel threatened. Ariel, meanwhile, exited the room, unaware of the conversation she had unknowingly sparked among the staff. She only sensed the lingering tension in the air, a magnetic pull of hostility she couldn't yet define. But something inside her whispered that the moment she walked into that room, the competition shifted from an academic event to a silent confrontation. She sensed that someone, likely the woman behind the desk, had already begun shaping obstacles that she would be expected to overcome alone. Later that afternoon, a message appeared on the classroom board, announcing a new procedural update to the competition. It was framed as an enhancement meant to encourage academic rigor, but its true purpose became clear as soon as the details were read. A single additional requirement had been introduced. One participant would need to submit an expanded research component, complete with supplemental evaluation by a panel not required for anyone else. And the name assigned to this requirement was not hidden in fine print. It was listed clearly beside the new rule, attached to only one student, Ariel Monroe. The room buzzed with a mixture of curiosity and latent amusement. Some students exchanged knowing glances, their lips curling at the edges as though entertained by the subtle targeting. Karen stood at the front, her expression unreadable except for the faint sparkle in her eyes, the unmistakable satisfaction of someone who believed she had restored order without ever raising her voice. Ariel stared at the board, her heartbeat growing heavier with each second. She tried to understand the logic behind the new rule, but no explanation could justify why she alone had been singled out. The message was clear, even without spoken words. She was being placed under a harsher, more burdensome spotlight, one designed to slow her down, exhaust her, or intimidate her into quitting. But rather than crumble, she stood still, letting the shock settle into determination. Her chest tightened with the weight of unfairness, yet she refused to let the moment fracture her resolve. If anything, it confirmed exactly what she suspected. This competition was rigged long before she entered, and the person orchestrating it had already begun her campaign against her. And as Ariel walked out of the room with the silent stares of her peers trailing behind her, she realized that the real battle had only just begun. Karen added a mysterious new rule to the competition, and only Ariel was required to follow it. But rumor now spread that Karen planned to introduce even more changes targeting her alone. The news of the mysterious new requirement clung to the hallways like a heavy fog the next morning. Ariel felt its presence long before she stepped into the classroom. Eyes drifted toward her whenever she passed, not openly hostile but sharpened with curiosity, as though the students sensed something unusual unfolding but enjoyed watching from a distance. After yesterday's shock, she had spent the night piecing together her thoughts, determined not to let a teacher's bias shrink her ambition. Yet she still felt a quiet tremor inside, a reminder that she was walking into a battle she never asked for. She braced herself before entering the room, expecting tension but not the storm that waited. Mrs. Karen Holloway stood at the board, her calm posture almost performative, as if she had waited all night to unveil the next phase of her design. She held a neat stack of folders in her hand, each marked with the names of competing students. But when she placed the stack on her desk, she pulled out one folder separately, placing it atop the pile with deliberate emphasis. Ariel recognized the color immediately. It was the same blue folder used for special category entrants in previous competitions, the rare students given unique assignments for enrichment programs. But there was nothing enriching about the cold expression on Karen's face when she looked at Ariel. Without giving the class time to settle, Karen announced an update to the competition guidelines. She framed her tone as authoritative and organized, making it seem like a routine announcement. Every student, she explained, would now be required to incorporate a community service component into their project, a manageable task that drew nods of approval around the room. Some students appeared pleased. They had volunteer hours from family-sponsored events or connections that made such tasks effortless. But before anyone could settle into the comfort of this new rule, Karen shifted the direction of her announcement, her eyes falling heavily on Ariel with an almost rehearsed precision. She added that one participant would need to complete an expanded version of the project, one requiring measurable data collected from community engagement, a written section referencing legal precedent, and most challenging of all, a live panel of evaluators during the presentation. Her voice never wavered as she spoke, never softened or sharpened, but the glint in her eyes made the intention unmistakable. When she named the student assigned to the expanded requirement, her tone didn't change, yet the room collectively stiffened. Ariel Monroe. As the words left her mouth, the shift in the classroom was immediate. Several students exchanged quick glances, some whispering with thin smiles stretched across their faces. A few seemed almost entertained, as if watching a predictable storyline unfold exactly as expected. Others simply sank into their seats, choosing to stay uninvolved. Even the students who admired Ariel's determination remained silent, their fear of being associated with her outweighing any desire to defend her. Ariel's breath caught for a moment, but she refused to let the emotion show. She studied the requirement carefully, recognizing how much heavier her workload had suddenly become. The extra demands were not simply difficult. They were designed to isolate her. Community data collection would require time and resources most students didn't have access to, let alone a student already navigating school biases. The legal precedent requirement was advanced enough to challenge even undergraduate students. The live panel was an entirely different beast, exposing her to scrutiny the others would never face. And yet Karen presented it all as if she were doing Ariel a favor, offering an opportunity instead of quietly tightening a leash. When the announcement ended, a murmur rippled through the room. Even the principal, who happened to walk in during the tail end of the briefing, paused with surprise on his face. He hesitated, scanning the updated rubric, clearly taken aback by the sudden addition. But Karen's smooth explanation, framed as an effort to strengthen academic rigor and prepare exceptional students for higher expectations, silenced any questions he might have asked. He nodded reluctantly, though Ariel noticed confusion lingering in his posture as he left the room. The bureaucracy that had swallowed countless complaints over the years swallowed this one too. Ariel tried to speak up, her calm voice carried with a quiet strength, but her protest dissolved into the same administrative void that so many of her concerns had met before. She tried to describe the unfairness, the imbalance, the lack of transparency, but Karen responded with the detached composure of someone who believed strongly in the untouchability of her authority. She insisted the adjustment was appropriate and beneficial, and even suggested that Ariel should feel honored. The dismissal cut more deeply than the extra workload itself. It was a reminder that no matter how hard she tried, her voice could be minimized with a single sentence spoken by someone who never saw her as equal. The rest of the students settled back into their tasks, ignoring the mechanical tightening in Ariel's chest. She returned to her seat, gathering her papers with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain composed. She felt the eyes around her again, not mocking outright, but observing with the kind of detached curiosity reserved for those who seemed destined to struggle. Her mind raced through scenarios, imagining what the next few weeks would require. Yet beneath her anxiety, a stubborn fire burned. She refused to let Karen Holloway's schemes define her outcome. When she returned home that evening, a heaviness followed her through the front door. Her mother noticed immediately, though Ariel tried to carry herself with strength. But it was her older brother Miles who stopped her at the dining table, sensing the unspoken frustration beneath her quiet movements. He watched her spread out the new requirements, noting the strain behind her calmness. As a second-year law student, he recognized the legal precedent component instantly and understood the intensity of the task his sister was suddenly expected to complete. His eyes darkened with concern, not because he doubted her ability, but because he understood how systems disguised inequity behind language and policy. Miles leaned in, studying the rubric with the sharp focus of someone trained to discern buried intentions. He identified subtle patterns, ambiguous wording, uneven standards, loopholes that allowed Karen to shift expectations whenever convenient. His expression shifted from concern to a protective determination. He could see what was happening even more clearly than Ariel could. The rules were not merely challenging, they were strategically crafted to overwhelm her. Yet instead of letting this discourage his sister, He reframed it as an opportunity to dismantle the bias from within. Together they transformed the dining table into a war room. Miles outlined potential legal frameworks, helping her understand how to incorporate constitutional concepts that would elevate her project beyond the level expected of any high school student. He explained how policy could be analyzed alongside community data, guiding her in a way that blended academic rigor with personal empowerment. Ariel absorbed every piece of information, fueled not by desperation but by a growing sense of purpose. She realized she had an unexpected advantage. While Karen thought she was placing burdens on her, she had inadvertently opened a pathway for Ariel to build something extraordinary. For a moment, the heaviness lifted. Ariel felt equipped, even strengthened, knowing she was no longer alone in this battle. She returned to her laptop that night, with renewed clarity, drafting her research framework with meticulous precision. Her words flowed with intention, carving out space for herself in a competition that was never meant to include her. She lost track of time as she wrote, shaping a project that was no longer just an assignment but a statement. She saved her file, organized her sources, and logged out feeling a pride she hadn't anticipated. But the next morning, something felt wrong. When Ariel logged into the school's server to retrieve her draft, the folder containing her project was missing. At first, she thought she had made a mistake, searching the directory multiple times, clicking through every folder and subfolder. But each attempt led to the same empty screen. Her heart tightened. She checked her backups, searching for the version she had uploaded late the previous night. Nothing. Her project hours of work, intricate research, her entire foundation for meeting Karen's impossible demands, had vanished completely. And the server logs showed something far more unsettling. The file wasn't just missing, it had been deleted. Ariel stared in disbelief as she realized her entire project file had mysteriously disappeared from the school server. Not corrupted, not misplaced, but intentionally erased. Ariel Monroe was at the school building, before the first lights had fully settled over the parking lot. The sky still wore the soft bruise of dawn, streaked in violet and fading gray, as she moved down the deserted hallways with silent urgency. Every echo of her footsteps reminded her, she wasn't just ahead of schedule, she was chasing a ghost. The sick realization that her entire project had vanished from the school server haunted her all night. She hadn't slept. Her mind had spiraled through every scenario, every keystroke, every folder path. There was no mistake. What had disappeared wasn't an accident. Someone had gone in and erased it. The only question that remained was who and why. By the time she reached the media center, the tech room lights were still off. She knocked anyway, then again until the door creaked open. The network technician, a young man who barely looked older than the students, blinked at her with confusion. She explained quickly, keeping her voice steady despite the weight of panic pressing behind her ribs. She asked him to check the server logs, file history, access timestamps, anything that could explain how her submission disappeared. His fingers clacked against the keyboard as he navigated through the directory, then paused. His expression stiffened as the screen refreshed. There it was. Her project folder. Deleted. Not corrupted. Not lost in a shuffle of files. Deleted manually. And not just deleted from her user account, but purged from the admin archive. It wasn't an accident. The final access was made under an administrative credential. The tech's face tightened, and his tone changed to one of careful neutrality as he delivered the explanation. The file had been deleted by someone using admin access, and the action couldn't be reversed. He said it plainly, like someone reading a line he had recited before. She watched him shift uncomfortably, glancing at her as if he wanted to say more but had already said too much. She thanked him and walked out with legs heavier than before. She was halfway down the hallway when the second gut punch landed. Her instincts pulled her toward her locker. Something about the way it sat slightly ajar when she knew she had slammed it shut yesterday. The lock was still on, but barely. Her hands moved with shaking speed as she opened it, and when the door swung open, she froze. Inside, resting on top of her binders, was her backup USB drive, or rather, what remained of it. The plastic casing had been twisted, snapped clean through the middle, its insides exposed and mangled. No note, no explanation. Just the evidence left behind by someone who wanted her to know it was intentional. Her breath came slow and sharp, like glass in her lungs. This wasn't just academic pressure anymore. This was psychological warfare. Someone had crossed a line, had reached into her private space, violated it, and destroyed what she built. And the message was loud now. She wasn't meant to finish this competition. She was meant to be exhausted, erased, defeated before she ever got to speak. Every step forward she took was being met with invisible hands pulling her 2 steps back. When she walked into homeroom, the classroom was alive with whispers. She could feel the heat of eyes landing on her, hear the stifled chuckles hidden behind palms, the sideways glances followed by smirks. One voice, just loud enough to pierce the silence, made a joke about students who get cold feet and quit when it gets hard. Laughter followed, light but sharp, the kind that didn't just mock it wounded. She didn't need to turn around to know who said it. She had already begun to memorize the tones of those who doubted her. But Ariel didn't crumble. She sat straight, pulled out her binder, and began again. There was no time to mourn a lost file when a new one needed to be rebuilt. Her notes were still intact. Her mind was still sharp. Her will had not been broken. It had been tested. And now it burned brighter. That afternoon she returned home and began the painstaking task of reconstructing her research. With every slide she recreated, she added more precision, more depth, more fire. Her new outline wasn't just a replication of the old one. It was an evolution. Stronger, smarter, clearer. Every piece of sabotage only hardened her resolve. It was no longer about impressing judges. It was about proving that no matter how many hurdles were thrown at her, she would leap over every one. What Ariel didn't know was that while she was rebuilding her project, Karen Holloway was building something too. An invisible wall between Ariel and success. In a private email exchange with the judging panel, Karen quietly slipped in a warning. She framed it carefully, disguising accusation as concern. She claimed Ariel had become emotionally reactive, hinted that she had difficulty respecting school protocols, and suggested that her project might come with behavioral complications. There were no specifics, just insinuations, slippery and untraceable, the kind that would never show up on paper, but would sit in the back of the panel's mind when they watched Ariel speak. It was a seed, and Karen had planted it with confidence that it would grow by the time final evaluations arrived. By the next week, Ariel's new momentum was taking shape. Her data collection plan was sharper, her legal references deeper, and her community interview, perhaps the most critical piece of the entire presentation, was scheduled. Her interview partner, a student from another class named Lindsay, had volunteered to join after seeing the unfair workload placed on Ariel. She was one of the few white students who had quietly offered help without seeking credit. Ariel had been skeptical at first, but slowly allowed herself to trust her. For a moment it felt like the balance was shifting, that fairness might find its way into at least one part of this process. But that sense of equilibrium was shattered the night before the interview. Ariel received a short message, sterile and impersonal, from Lindsay's school email. It was barely 3 sentences, stating that she could no longer participate due to personal obligations. There was no apology, no explanation, just a quick withdrawal that felt more like a warning than a regret. Ariel stared at the screen, the words blurring as her heart sank. She called. No answer. She messaged. No reply. The silence grew louder by the minute. Later that evening, through a friend of a friend, Ariel heard what Lindsay hadn't said in her message, that her parents had found out about her involvement in the project and weren't comfortable with their daughter being entangled in drama. They had pulled her out quietly, choosing the path of least resistance, teaching their child the oldest lesson in institutional comfort. When things get messy, abandon those who bear the mess. Ariel sat at her desk long after the sun had gone down, staring at the empty chair across from her. She had planned the entire interview structure around having a partner. The questions, the setting, the dynamic. It was all built for 2, and now she was alone again. Abandoned not just by someone who promised to help, but by a system that had taught that girl to back away the moment things became inconvenient. But something deeper shifted inside Ariel. That night, she didn't cry, she didn't scream, she didn't ask for fairness anymore. She simply reached for her notebook and began rewriting the interview script. This time, as a solo narrative. If the system refused to allow her a partner, she would make her voice echo loud enough to fill the entire room by herself. But just as Ariel finalized her updated questions, her phone buzzed, and the text made her hands go cold. Her new interview location had been canceled. The community site had pulled out without explanation. The air inside the school building had shifted. Ariel could feel it in the subtle, almost imperceptible ways that people avoided eye contact as she passed. The glances no longer carried curiosity, they carried judgment. The silence in the hallways had weight, like it was trying to press her out of the space entirely. But what struck her most wasn't the silence. It was the absence. By Friday morning, The news had reached her that the second volunteer partner, Jillian Harper, a soft-spoken junior known for her punctuality and honor roll status, had officially withdrawn from the community segment of the project. Just days earlier, she'd sat across from Ariel in the media lab, offering to help capture interviews and organize outreach events. Her tone had been supportive, her eyes eager to do something meaningful. But now, like clockwork, she had pulled out without so much as a direct conversation. The excuse had come through a teacher in the form of a polite summary. Her parents had decided it was not the right time for Jillian to be involved in a project with so much attention and pressure. The message wasn't just insulting. It was layered in cowardice. Jillian hadn't even bothered to say it herself. Her words had been filtered through school staff as if Ariel were a PR problem, rather than a classmate. Ariel's chest tightened as the sting settled in. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure, wrapped in politeness. The kind of avoidance only privilege could afford. Still, she didn't cry. She had cried once, after her project had been wiped off the server, and she had vowed not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break again. She walked through the day with her shoulders squared, her face neutral, while her mind calculated how to rebuild a project that was now entirely dependent on her voice and resilience. But the absence of allies wasn't the worst of it. What came next was quieter, more corrosive. Whispers began trailing her name down the hallway. Not confrontational, just cutting. Ariel had heard her name float in the corners of locker conversations and cafeteria huddles. It was always followed by phrases like trying too hard, think she's special, or the one that made her throat tighten too aggressive. She began to notice how classmates who once smiled at her now nodded stiffly, or looked away altogether. The teachers weren't much different. They treated her like she was difficult, not because she had misbehaved, but because her persistence demanded attention they didn't want to give. She was becoming a mirror they didn't want to look into, one that reflected the discomfort of someone who refused to play small. Even her longtime friend Max Rivera, someone who had grown up 2 houses down from her and shared sidewalk chalk summers and late-night study sessions, began to fade from view. He still offered a generic wave when they passed in the hallway, but he no longer sat next to her at lunch. No more texts checking in. No more shared jokes about Mrs. Holloway's never-ending sweater collection. Max wasn't cruel. He was just absent. He didn't owe her loyalty. Ariel knew that. But what cut deep was the silence. The refusal to acknowledge the storm swirling around her. The decision to watch from a distance, like everyone else. At first, Ariel convinced herself she could work through it. She doubled down on her script, reconstructed her outline, and restructured the community segment. She mapped it all to a solo presentation format that met every requirement Karen had imposed. She even expanded her legal reference section to include education equity laws, embedding her lived experience into the theory. The work was hard. The loneliness, hard. But none of it was random. Every piece of resistance she faced followed a pattern, each moment drawing clearer the real aim behind it all. This wasn't about her performance. It wasn't even about the project. It was about teaching her a lesson, that ambition had a limit, and girls like her weren't allowed to cross it. She was being reminded, in small and cutting ways, that her presence was only tolerated if it remained unthreatening. The smear campaign didn't come with flyers or open insults. It came in the form of body language, whispers, and tone. A teacher who once praised her work now said her recent attitude was borderline disrespectful. A classmate who had borrowed her notes last semester now told someone else she was playing the victim. The narrative was shifting, and Ariel was being recast from a hard-working student to a problem. The cruelty was not loud. That's what made it dangerous. It culminated one afternoon when Ariel returned to her locker to find a folded piece of paper, unmarked and thin, resting delicately at the top of her books. She paused, stared at it for a moment, then reached for it slowly, her fingers trembling slightly though her face remained still. It wasn't handwritten. It was printed. Cold. Calculated. Typed in all caps like a quiet threat disguised as advice. Drop out before it gets worse. No name. No signature. Just the message. Short, sharp, designed to cut fast and deep. Ariel stood there for a long time, the paper pressed between her fingers like it might ignite. She didn't react. She didn't show fear. But inside something shifted. Not toward defeat. Toward resolve. Whoever had left that note had believed she was close to breaking. And that's what made it so satisfying to them. It wasn't a warning. It was a dare. She tucked the paper in her folder, not to forget it, but to remember, to keep it as evidence. Not just for herself, but for anyone else they might try to silence after her. She wasn't sure who had written it. It could have been a student, a teacher, or even someone working behind the scenes. But what mattered more than the identity was the intention. They wanted her gone. They wanted her quiet. That evening, she didn't eat dinner at the table. She told her mom she had work to do. She sat in her room for hours, redrafting her speaking notes, adding new slides to her presentation, creating backups of her backups. She created copies on cloud servers, external drives, and even emailed it to herself with subject lines only she could recognize. Every minute she worked was a quiet act of defiance. But in the middle of revising her final community impact slide, her inbox pinged again. It was a forwarded message. It had no subject. And when she opened it, the body of the message contained a single thread, an internal school email from Karen Holloway. She hadn't meant for Ariel to see it. She hadn't meant for anyone outside the judge's circle to see it. But someone unexpected had sent it. The email revealed that Karen was coaching one of the other contestants, Logan Pierce, behind the scenes. Worse, she was feeding him private details from Ariel's project draft. Ariel stared at the forwarded email long after the sun had disappeared behind the window pane of her room. The glowing screen in front of her cast a pale electric light across her face. But her mind was burning hotter than the machine ever could. The message confirmed what she already suspected. This competition was being twisted in the shadows. The email sent from Karen Holloway to the judging panel referenced a student, Logan Pierce, and contained pointed language about helping him craft a stronger narrative to counter another project that might be positioned as emotionally manipulative. Ariel didn't need to be named to know she was the other project. But that wasn't what made her pulse spike. The final attachment in the email was a summary, her own summary, pulled directly from a draft she hadn't even submitted yet. Karen had seen it. Somehow, she had accessed the folder Ariel thought was private. She had read through it, picked it apart, and handed its contents to the very student positioned as her competition. Karen wasn't just undermining her. She was feeding her opponent. For a moment, Ariel couldn't move. The room felt colder, smaller, as if the betrayal itself had sucked the air from the walls. She thought back to every moment she had second-guessed herself. Every time she wondered if she was imagining the sabotage. She wasn't. She had been made a target by someone with power. And now, with undeniable evidence, she saved the email thread, encrypted it, and backed it up in 4 separate locations. Then she sat back in her chair, trying to find breath between the walls of rage, slowly closing in around her. The next day at school, her name hung heavier in the air than usual. She moved through the corridors like someone crossing enemy territory, every step sharp with tension. No one spoke directly to her, but the weight of unseen whispers pressed against her back like fingers waiting to shove. Her locker door had been left slightly open again, and this time when she pulled it, a cascade of shredded paper and trash poured out onto her feet. Her books were torn, her notes ruined, her backup folders smeared with ink like someone had tried to erase her work without even pretending it was accidental. Ariel stood still as the remnants of her academic life spilled across the floor. Students passed by. They looked, they saw, and they kept walking. Eyes forward, heads tilted slightly away. Not a single person stopped. They moved around her like she was debris. She knelt slowly, hands shaking not from fear, but from the sheer emotional weight of being publicly discarded. She reached for her papers, but her fingers froze when she spotted it. Another note, not typed this time, handwritten, thin-lined pen, the kind teachers used when grading essays, folded into 4 neat squares, and tucked beneath her ruined schedule. She unfolded it slowly, bracing for the same threat as last time, but this one was different. This one was quiet, careful. "You're wasting your time. No matter what you say, they've already decided." The handwriting struck her like a cold hand to the face. It wasn't a student's scribble or a rushed message meant to shock. It was neat, controlled, familiar. Her mind rifled through memories, whiteboards, red pens, mid-morning feedback sessions, and landed on a chilling conclusion. It looked exactly like Karen Holloway's. The weight of that suspicion coiled in her stomach, like rusted metal. Her mother had warned her this wouldn't be easy, but even she hadn't expected this kind of calculated intimidation. That evening, at home, Ariel sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. Her mother listened in silence as Ariel laid out everything. The email, the vandalized locker, the second note. She didn't speak for a long time. She simply reached over and took Ariel's hand, the gesture both grounding and heartbreaking. Ariel's mother had grown up in the same state, had gone to schools just like this one. She understood what it meant when power dressed itself up in professionalism, what it meant to be labeled difficult just for trying to be seen. Her advice was firm, but tender. Don't stop. Let them keep showing who they are. Just make sure you have everything documented. But Ariel didn't need permission anymore. She was already past the point of retreat. The next morning, she returned early again. Not for schoolwork, not for meetings, for answers. She made her way down to the basement floor where the janitor's office was tucked away behind the boiler room. Mr. Devon, the longtime custodian, had always been a quiet presence in the school. Unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore once you started paying attention. He was tall, older, with a face carved by silence and years of watching things unfold. He'd seen Ariel picking up the pieces from her locker. He hadn't spoken then, just helped her gather the scraps, his movements efficient but not unkind. This morning she waited for him near the stairwell, unsure how to start, but he spoke first, not with small talk, not with pleasantries, just one low sentence that hung in the air like smoke. Look into the judges, she blinked. He didn't elaborate. He just handed her a broom, almost as if pretending this was a casual moment, and kept moving. She followed him halfway down the hallway, before he paused again. One of them's not who you think. Then he was gone. That was all she needed. Ariel returned to the school library, logged into a secure computer, and began digging. The judge list wasn't public yet, not officially, but past years had followed a pattern. Most were community leaders, alumni or selected faculty members. With a few clicks in cached files, she found a name that hadn't meant anything to her before. Brad Holloway. The surname alone triggered alarm. She checked the directory. No staff, no faculty listing. But a deep dive into archived district newsletters revealed the link. Brad Holloway was Karen's cousin. He had served as a panel judge 3 times in the past 5 years. Each time the competition winner had come from Karen's own debate class. 2 complaints had been filed against his judging, both citing bias and procedural manipulation. Both had been closed with no action taken. The reports were buried, misfiled in categories marked unsubstantiated. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, a storm building behind her ribcage. She didn't just have sabotage anymore. She had names, connections, pattern. Karen wasn't just trying to humiliate her in class. She had stacked the judging panel itself. Ariel printed the documents and filed them away. This was no longer just about a project. This was a map of who held the power and how far they were willing to go to protect it. She stepped out into the hallway, suddenly hyper-aware of every glance, every silence, every smirk that trailed her path. They thought they had erased her,
But all they had done was awaken her. That night, Ariel receives a letter slipped under her front door, an official notice that her community presentation will now require pre-approval from a newly appointed judge, Brad Holloway.
The letter on the floor looked official. Ariel stared at it under the dim glow of the porch light, her fingers curling around its crisp edge, as if bracing for what it might contain. Inside, the language was smooth and formal, crafted to appear routine, but buried between the carefully selected words was a sharp truth. Her community presentation, the most critical component of her project, would now require pre-approval. The approving party, Brad Holloway, the same man whose name she had just unearthed as Karen's cousin, a judge whose presence on the panel had already raised red flags in her mind. Now, with this document, he was no longer simply a judge. He was a gatekeeper. The connection was no longer speculative. It was structural. Karen had embedded her bias into every level of the competition, designing an obstacle course where the hurdles were invisible to everyone else. Brad wasn't just someone judging from a distance. He was now the one controlling whether Ariel's work could even be seen. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. That night, Ariel's room transformed into a war room again. Papers spread across her desk, her laptop glowing with tabs of news clippings, archived school bulletins, and old judging records. 5 competitions, 5 winners, all white, all from Karen's mentorship program. In at least 2 of those years, Black students had reached the finals. Their names were mentioned only briefly in the closing remarks. She read through the complaints filed against Brad. Accusations of subjective scoring, failure to follow rubric guidelines, and suspicious tiebreaker decisions. Each time, the district's response had been cold and consistent. Reviewed. No further action recommended. The implication was clear. Volunteers couldn't be held to the same scrutiny as staff. They were protected by a cloak of goodwill and ambiguity. Ariel couldn't decide what angered her more. That the school allowed this, or that so many pretended not to see it. She didn't waste time hoping the system would hold him accountable. Instead, she decided to build her own case. Her mother, silent but steady through the chaos, helped her begin documenting everything. Every interaction with Karen was now recorded. Every rubric change, email edit or policy shift was printed, logged and time-stamped. Ariel's phone, once just a tool for music and messages, became a quiet witness to her fight. If they wanted to rewrite the rules, she would preserve the original script, proof that her effort had never lacked integrity. The next day, she walked into the principal's office armed with documentation. Her folder was thick with evidence, the pattern of rigged judging, the relationship between Karen and Brad, the sudden shifts in her competition requirements. She sat across from the man who had once praised her academic excellence and laid out her findings with measured precision. She wasn't angry. She was surgical. She expected resistance. She got something worse, indifferent. The principal skimmed her pages without absorbing them, his posture rigid, but uninterested. He adjusted his glasses as if that could shield him from discomfort. When she mentioned the family connection between Karen and Brad, he raised his brows slightly, but not in surprise. When she brought up the past complaints, he offered a rehearsed sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Brad's a volunteer," he said calmly. "We're lucky to have him at all. We can't dictate who gets involved in these things. The district approves the panel, not me." The words settled like dust in the air. Ariel realized in that moment how easily bureaucracy could be used as a weapon. Policies were walls, and people like Brad, like Karen, knew exactly how to hide behind them. She left the office with no resolution, only more clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a system functioning exactly as it was designed, to keep people like her out of the winner's circle, all while smiling and applauding her participation. She walked the hallways differently after that. Not faster or angrier, just sharper, eyes open, chin high. Every time someone glanced at her with that silent skepticism, she met it with unwavering focus. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to survive their sabotage and still rise. Her mother took the next step, filing a quiet but formal complaint with the school district. It was written carefully, with no accusations, just documented concerns about procedural fairness, conflict of interest and transparency. They didn't expect immediate change. That wasn't the point. It was about making a record, a line in history that said someone noticed. Still, as Ariel pushed forward, the walls continued to tighten. Her project was nearly complete again, and her presentation slides had been rebuilt with even more precision than before. Her legal precedent section was now layered with examples of institutional bias, education disparities, and student protection laws. Her voice in the script was no longer defensive. It was defiant. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every student who had been quietly pushed to the margins and told to be grateful they were even allowed in the room. But the backlash was building. That afternoon, while walking past the stairwell near the science wing, Ariel noticed a group of students huddled around a phone. Their eyes flicked toward her with the kind of awkward sympathy that made her stomach twist. She knew that look. Something had happened. By the time she reached the library, her phone was buzzing. Notifications. Dozens of them. Her name was trending in a local hashtag. Someone had leaked her personal essay, the one she had submitted as part of her original project draft, the version that detailed her experience growing up in a predominantly white school district, the feeling of being underestimated, the microaggressions she had cataloged like bruises. It had been raw, vulnerable, real, and now it was public. Posted on a student-run page without context, framed as emotional manipulation. The caption read, "Is this debate or trauma bait?" The comments poured in. Some mocking, others vicious. Why's everything gotta be about race with her? She's not oppressed. She's just loud. This is what happens when they let politics into school. She's making herself the victim to win. Typical angry black girl energy. Ariel sat frozen in the library's back corner, her hands numb as she scrolled. The words weren't just cruel. They were strategic, designed to strip her of credibility, to make her story a joke before she even had the chance to speak it on stage. She looked around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of every student with a phone, every glance in her direction. Her private reflections, torn from context, were now ammunition in someone else's game. She logged off, not because she was giving up, but because she understood now more than ever. This wasn't about a trophy. This was about survival in a world that resented her audacity to believe she belonged. That night, an anonymous message was left in her inbox. 3 chilling words. You've been warned. Ariel stared at the message in her inbox. You've been warned. It didn't come with a sender's name. No profile picture. No email trace. Just a blank, unfiltered threat, delivered with surgical precision at the moment. She was already unraveling. She had expected resistance. But this was exposure. Vulnerability as punishment. Her story twisted. Her identity weaponized. Her personal essay ripped from its private home and plastered across the digital walls of a student-run gossip forum was no longer hers. She had written it with intention, not pity. It was a testimony to everything she'd endured at Eastwood High. The erasures, the microaggressions, the silent ceilings. But online, it was now reduced to a meme factory. Screenshot after screenshot flooded the thread, paired with gifs mocking her tone, calling her dramatic, saying she was milking her race card. The cruelty escalated fast. Within hours, the thread had grown from idle gossip to pure vitriol. The slurs weren't coded anymore. They came naked. Some anonymous, others from accounts bearing student names. She read them with detached horror. Typical woke snowflake, looking for attention. Maybe if she stopped playing victim, she'd get somewhere. She's not even that smart. Just loud. Go back to Africa, Ariel. She's everything wrong with this generation. Her photo was posted next. A screenshot from her class ID. Cropped and filtered. Her face turned into a mockery. The caption read, "Meet our school's MLK. More lies than knowledge." The burn was instant. Her lungs constricted with the kind of silent rage that didn't scream. It smoldered. She couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unhear the cackling silence from her classmates who watched it all unfold and did nothing. The thread, originally limited to Eastwood High, started bleeding into surrounding schools. Students from other districts joined in. They didn't know her. They didn't care. They just piled on. But something unexpected happened as the pile-on grew. Buried deep in the comments section, a stranger's message appeared. Then another, then more. Names Ariel didn't recognize began calling out the racism, asking questions, quoting her essay in solidarity, linking to her project summary, and comparing it to national education statistics. Someone reposted the original essay on a different platform, not to mock it, but to elevate it. Then came the reposts on Twitter. Someone uploaded screenshots with the caption, "A black student speaks truth in a white school, and they tear her apart. Read this essay." It went viral overnight. The traction was fast, sharp, and overwhelming. By morning, "Stand with Ariel" trended locally. A college alum from Eastwood, a black woman who had graduated 10 years earlier, shared the post with her own thread. She talked about the racism she faced in the same classrooms, under the same teacher. She confirmed the silence of administrators. She said she had tried to write about it once, but her counselor told her to keep it positive for college apps. Now Ariel's voice had cracked the dam. Other former students joined in. Anonymous or bold-faced, they all carried the same theme. This wasn't new. Ariel was just the first one to survive long enough to speak it publicly.
The story exploded.
A civil rights nonprofit based out of Atlanta took notice. They released a public statement calling on Eastwood High to investigate allegations of discrimination, citing Ariel's case as a potential civil rights violation. News outlets began requesting interviews. A few national education advocates posted her screenshots, adding context about structural bias in school competitions. What started as a local smear campaign had turned national. And Ariel? She sat at her desk staring at the open browser tabs, unsure how to process the shift. The same words that once burned her skin were now fueling support she hadn't imagined possible. But the irony wasn't lost on her. She had become visible only by being violated. Her mother wept quietly that night, not just from fear, but from pride sharpened by rage. Her daughter's strength had forced a system to pay attention, but visibility came with cost. Now she was no longer a student with a project. She was a symbol, and symbols, history had taught them both, were easy to tear down. On campus, the energy was fractured. Some students avoided Ariel like she was radioactive. Others approached her in secret, whispering support they didn't have the courage to say aloud. A few bold ones mocked her even more openly now, leaning into the narrative that she had gone too far, that she had made this bigger than it needed to be. But none of them dared say it to her face. Because now she was no longer alone. That shift didn't sit well with the administration. 3 days after the story went viral, Ariel was called into the principal's office again. The energy was different this time. The door was already open when she arrived. No greeting, no pretense, just the principal sitting rigid behind his desk, flanked by a school board liaison and a district communications officer. Their smiles were polite. Their tone was sterile. They began by talking about concerns. They mentioned the school's reputation, then the words twisted into something more dangerous. Academic integrity, disciplinary discretion, and finally, disqualification criteria. They danced around the subject until the sentence landed. You need to tone down the outside attention, or it could affect your eligibility. Ariel didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just stared back as the sentence echoed between the walls. They were threatening to disqualify her, not because she broke a rule, not because she cheated, but because she refused to disappear. They said it was for the good of the competition. They said they needed the focus to return to academics. But Ariel heard the truth behind the sanitized language. She was being told to shrink, to fold herself back into the margins where she could be ignored again. But the twist came when she stepped out of the office, shaken but composed, and saw the group waiting in the hallway. It wasn't students. It was parents, 4 of them, black mothers and fathers, standing shoulder to shoulder outside the admin wing, waiting quietly, with printed copies of Ariel's essay in hand. They nodded at her as she passed. They weren't loud. They didn't chant. They were just present. And in their presence, Ariel understood. The story was no longer hers alone. That evening, the school quietly updates the competition rules again, adding a clause that could allow removal from finalists due to disciplinary disruptions or external media involvement. And they timestamp it, retroactively. The hallway outside the main office still echoed with the weight of that quiet resistance. Ariel had walked past those 4 parents with her back straight, but her stomach twisted in knots. Their presence had been a balm to her blistering isolation. Yet it also marked a turning point. She had become a symbol louder than intended, bigger than expected, and that scared people who liked their power unchallenged. The very next morning, the school's mood shifted with even more precision. This time, it wasn't just students avoiding her gaze. It was faculty. Teachers who had once nodded politely, now stiffened when she entered a room. Her math teacher suddenly decided her phone needed to be turned in at the start of every period, just to avoid distraction. Her counselor, once warm and helpful, now reminded her of the importance of professionalism in a competitive environment. Ariel wasn't imagining it. The air was colder, sharper, lined with an invisible thread that warned her, "You've gone too far." It didn't take long for the punishment to become formal. She was called into the principal's office again, this time alone. No school board member, no parent liaison. Just the principal, and his ever-so-rehearsed voice, his sentences laced with concern but hollow at the core. He said the words slowly, like he wanted them to sound reasonable. Ariel's online presence, he claimed, had become disruptive to school culture. He cited the growing distraction, the influx of media inquiries, and the risk of misinformation harming other students. But beneath the language of discipline was something unmistakable, a demand for silence. The message was clear: if you don't stop making noise, we'll take everything from you. To drive the point further home, Karen Holloway filed a formal report the same day. Ariel was informed by email that she was being cited for inappropriate behavior during a class discussion, though no specific incident was listed. The language was vague, strategic. Ariel had been careful in her words, professional in every interaction, but that didn't matter. The accusation didn't need to be true. It only needed to exist. By the end of the week, the school had escalated its quiet surveillance. Ariel noticed her school email now filtered certain messages into flagged folders. Her social media posts, even ones about books or study tips, were screenshotted and circulated among faculty group chats. She wasn't paranoid. She had proof. A friend in the office slipped her a forwarded message that showed Karen discussing Ariel's Twitter activity with the tone of someone documenting a criminal. She was being watched, not because she had broken rules, but because she had broken silence. The pressure was relentless. Her classmates shifted their seats away from hers in shared spaces. Group chats went cold. Study partners dropped out. It was the oldest tactic in the book. Ostracize the one who speaks, so the rest learn to keep quiet. Ariel wasn't just being sidelined, she was being isolated by design. Yet something inside her had already changed. She couldn't shrink anymore. Not even if she wanted to. That night, her brother Miles came over after his classes. When she told him what had happened, every warning, every vague citation, every tactic used to suffocate her momentum, he didn't flinch. He opened his laptop and pulled out a folder marked Education Code, Federal and State. He showed her sections on student rights, on retaliation, on First Amendment protections in academic spaces. He laid it out like a blueprint, not to scare her, to prepare her. Together they began drafting a formal grievance. It wasn't a complaint. It was a challenge wrapped in documentation. The language was clear, professional, and firm. It detailed the retaliation, the unequal treatment, the personal targeting by a faculty member with clear bias and personal conflict of interest. They included screenshots, timestamps, and copies of the updated rules. They attached the now viral essay, framing it not as a disruption, but as protected expression. The grievance was submitted to the district's Office of Equity and Inclusion, not the principal, not the counselor, the highest tier, a place where the words might not be dismissed with a shrug. Ariel didn't wait for approval to keep moving. While the school worked overtime to paint her as a problem, she buried herself in her work. Her presentation evolved into something beyond a school project. It became a mirror held up to the institution itself, polished, sharp, and impossible to ignore. She knew the semifinals were approaching fast. The list of remaining students had been finalized, and despite the school's quiet hostility, Ariel was still on it. Karen hadn't been able to disqualify her yet, so she changed tactics again. One afternoon, after finishing a practice round in an empty classroom, Ariel realized she had left her water bottle in the faculty conference room she had been allowed to use for prep. She retraced her steps, not expecting anything more than a quick grab and go. But as she neared the room, she slowed. The door was cracked. Inside, Karen stood at the long table, her back to the hallway. Her body leaned over several papers. Ariel paused. She couldn't see everything, but what she did see froze her. Score sheets, each one marked with a student's name, each one already filled in. Ariel's name was visible. She saw it clearly, and next to her name, numbers, altered in pen, not crossed out, not corrected, just changed. Karen hadn't seen her. Ariel slowly pulled out her phone, hand trembling but steady enough to tap the video record icon. She didn't step forward. She didn't confront. She captured the moment in silence. One long, slow video. The red dot blinking at the top of the screen like a heartbeat. She backed away, quiet as breath, retreating into the hallway before Karen could turn. Her own breath came in shallow bursts, but her expression stayed stone. She had always suspected manipulation. She had always feared the numbers were padded. But now she had seen it, captured it, proved it. They weren't just trying to silence her voice. They were trying to erase her scores. That night, Ariel watched the video again, and noticed something terrifying. Karen wasn't alone in the room. A second figure had been sitting in the corner the whole time, watching silently. The screen glowed softly in the dim light of Ariel's room, casting pale shadows against the wall as the video played on loop. Karen's posture was clear, leaned slightly forward, pen in hand, making subtle changes to the score sheets laid out in front of her. But it wasn't the edits alone that gripped Ariel's attention anymore. It was what the camera had unintentionally caught beyond Karen's desk. In the corner of the room, barely visible behind a filing cabinet, was the faint outline of another figure, unmoving, silent, watching. The person sat still, only the curve of their shoulder and the edge of a clipboard distinguishable. But it was enough. Karen hadn't just altered the scores in secret. She had done it with a witness. Ariel zoomed in, adjusting the contrast until the image sharpened just enough to catch a small detail on the clipboard. The school's crest. Whoever had been sitting in that room had official access, and whoever they were, they had watched it all happen. The next morning, Ariel didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the vice principal's office with the footage saved across 3 devices, and a printed transcript of what she had captured. She waited in silence as he watched the screen, his eyes fixed and unmoving, jaw tight. The video ended, and the room felt frozen in the stillness that followed. Then, with the kind of sigh that felt rehearsed, he leaned back and said he would look into it. That was it. No questions. No surprise. No urgency. Ariel sat there waiting for something more. Anything. But the silence that followed made one thing achingly clear. He already knew. Maybe not the details. Maybe not the timing. But the system protected itself, and her evidence had merely confirmed what the adults in power had long decided they'd rather ignore than confront. Days passed. Nothing changed. Karen remained in charge of the competition. The panelists remained untouched. Brad Holloway's name was still listed on internal schedules. Ariel's grievance sat unacknowledged by the district office, and when the semi-final results were posted, Ariel's team, despite meticulous work, the strongest public reception, and consistent rubric alignment, scored dead last. The silence was worse than an outright dismissal. It was proof that exposure didn't guarantee change. That even with evidence in hand, even with eyes wide open, a system rigged to protect itself would rather preserve the illusion of order than admit to rot. But what the administration hadn't anticipated was the crowd. The semifinals were held in the school auditorium. Students, teachers, and a number of parents had shown up, partly out of curiosity and partly due to the growing noise surrounding the competition. Ever since Ariel's story had gone viral, more people had begun attending school events, not to participate, but to witness. Phones were out. Social media updates buzzed in real time. When the score announcements were made, confusion rippled through the room like a sudden chill. Students exchanged glances. Parents frowned. Some whispered openly. Ariel sat still, her face unreadable. She had known this was coming, but the weight of the injustice still pressed hard against her chest. Not because she needed validation, but because the lie was no longer hidden. It was performed, bold and shameless, in front of an audience. And for once, the audience didn't stay silent. A parent stood up, then another. A student near the back called out that the scoring didn't match the rubric that had been posted weeks earlier. Someone asked for transparency. Phones captured every second. Within 24 hours, the video of the announcement and the crowd's shocked reaction hit the same channels that had elevated Ariel's essay. The pressure was no longer local. It was public. That's when Ariel made her next move. Using her legal right under the state's open records policy, she filed a formal request for all judging documentation from the competition. The school was legally obligated to respond, and when the files arrived, she combed through them like a detective with a fresh crime scene. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was written in ink. Each score sheet from the semifinals had been altered post-submission. The original scores, written in blue ink and dated the night of the competition, had been overwritten in black. The handwriting matched Karen. The timestamps on the digital copies didn't align with the judging session timeline. Some scores had been lowered by several full points. Others had been erased and replaced entirely. One judge's signature appeared twice, on two separate versions of the same sheet. Ariel didn't just have evidence. She had documentation that proved systemic tampering. She sent it all: files, comparisons, annotations to the school board and district compliance office. She didn't ask for a meeting. She sent facts, undeniable, cold, organized. And finally, the silence cracked. An emergency hearing was scheduled by the school board for the following Monday. The email went out to staff and parents late Friday night. It was clinical in tone but impossible to miss. Words like evaluation of protocol, integrity of scoring, and panel review signaled what had long been avoided: accountability. The school scrambled. Administrators huddled in closed-door meetings. Staff emails went dark. Teachers avoided eye contact in the hallways. Even Karen moved differently now. No longer smug, but cautious, eyes darting, lips pursed like someone realizing their armor had cracked. But what came next wasn't an apology. It was a retreat. Monday morning, an announcement was posted in the front office and sent by email to all students. The final round of the competition was postponed due to logistical concerns and scheduling conflicts. No new date was provided, no explanation beyond vague references to unforeseen circumstances. Ariel read the notice with a sinking feeling. She knew what this was. It wasn't a postponement. It was a cover-up in real time. Karen and likely others had decided the only way to win was to burn the entire competition to the ground. If Ariel couldn't be removed, they would remove the event itself. That way, there would be no scandal, no winner, no proof of defeat, just silence. Again. But Ariel wasn't the same girl who had quietly signed the competition list weeks earlier. She was no longer just fighting for a title. She was fighting for truth, and the attempt to cancel the event only proved how much they feared it. Hours after the cancellation notice goes out, Ariel receives a screenshot from an anonymous sender. It's an internal school email. The subject line reads, Plan B, replace final round with private evaluations. And beneath it, Brad Holloway's name again, this time marked as lead evaluator. The school's inbox flooded the moment the cancellation notice went out. The message had been dressed in the language of concern, phrases like unforeseen disruptions and safety precautions, crafted to sound like the administration was simply trying to maintain order. But beneath the surface, the truth bled through every line. Ariel knew what was happening. Everyone who had been watching this story unfold knew what was happening. The final round of the competition wasn't postponed because of logistics. It was being strangled out of existence. Karen Holloway had declared a security threat. That was the official justification. Unnamed, unverified, convenient. She claimed that the online attention surrounding the debate had drawn unwelcome actors into school affairs, and therefore canceling the final round was necessary to protect students from potential harm. It was a desperate move, but it was one the administration backed, at least at first. The backlash was instant. Students who had watched the chaos unfold for weeks erupted. The debate team group chat exploded with disbelief. A few who had remained silent finally spoke out. Even some of the students who had benefited from the biased system began questioning whether they could stand by any longer. But the loudest reaction came from the Black student body, a community that had silently watched one of their own fight, an entire machine alone, only to have the finish line yanked away at the last second. By the end of the day, the school's front lawn was covered in handmade posters. We saw the scores. No justice, no finals. Let Ariel speak. What began as a few students grew into dozens. Teachers peeked through blinds as Black students, joined by a handful of allies, held signs during lunch and after school. The administration tried to brush it off as a temporary disruption, but the protest didn't fade. It grew. Parents began to pick sides. Some flooded the front office demanding answers. Others wrote emails praising the cancellation and accusing Ariel of bringing politics into education. The divide became public, and with it came attention from places the school had tried desperately to keep away. Local media showed up on the third day. Cameras rolled as students held their signs, voices rising in chants that had started as whispers and now carried like thunder. A local anchor interviewed two students, one of whom pointed directly at the front office windows and said, "They're trying to silence her because they don't want us to see the truth." Then the crowd parted slightly as Ariel stepped forward. She hadn't planned to speak. She had spent days in silence, eyes focused, mouth shut, pouring everything into a speech she feared would never be delivered. But now, with the cameras rolling and a crowd waiting, she realized something. They had tried to erase her voice again, and failed. So she spoke. Not long, not loud, just clear. She told them what it felt like to be watched, but never seen. What it meant to carry double the weight, and still be told she didn't belong. She didn't beg for fairness. She didn't ask for sympathy. She declared the truth. I don't need to win to matter. But I won't be erased. The clip aired that evening across every major local channel. It was shared online by journalists, students, and educators. Ariel's voice, raw and precise, cut through the noise like glass. For the first time, the school's silence was louder than her defiance. That night, the district released a statement overriding the school's decision. A public final round would proceed. No private evaluations. No plan B. It would be held on the school's main stage, with press allowed to attend, and an independent observer assigned to the judging panel. Karen had lost her grip, but she hadn't let go. In the days leading up to the event, tension twisted through the building like smoke. Karen rarely left her classroom. Staff meetings were quiet and clipped. Rumors swirled of internal investigations, of possible suspensions, even of Karen being reassigned. Nothing confirmed, nothing denied. Ariel kept her head down and her preparation sharp. Her presentation was ready. Her research, timed to precision. Her slides, now backed up across 4 secure drives, were practiced like choreography. This was no longer just about her. It hadn't been for weeks. Now she carried the voices of everyone who had been dismissed, downgraded, or deleted. The morning of the final round arrived cold and cloudless. The school auditorium buzzed with an energy it had never known before. Students lined the hallway, dressed in everything from debate attire to protest shirts. Teachers whispered. Reporters gathered at the back entrance, and Ariel, calm but focused, walked in with her mother at her side, her name badge clipped to her blazer. But when she approached the check-in table near the auditorium entrance, something was wrong. Her name wasn't there. The list, printed in bold black ink and taped to the table's front, included 7 finalists. Ariel Monroe wasn't one of them. The woman behind the table, an assistant from the district office, stared blankly when Ariel pointed it out. She pulled out a binder, flipped pages, checked a secondary sheet. Still no name. Ariel's mother leaned in, firm and composed, and asked when the list had been finalized. The assistant muttered something about last-minute confirmations. and a different submission system. She offered to check with administration, then disappeared down the hallway. Minutes pass. The auditorium filled. The judges arrived. Karen stood in the corner, arms crossed, eyes cold. Her smile said everything. You may have made it to the building, but you still don't belong on the stage. Ariel stood still, breathing slow, holding the folder that contained every word of her speech. She hadn't come this far to be edited out again. But the paper taped to the table didn't lie. Her name was gone. As the first speaker is called to the stage, Ariel's phone buzzes. A new email notification slides across the screen. We need to talk. It's about the missing roster. I have proof. Sent anonymously. The buzz of the auditorium rose in waves as students and parents shuffled to their seats, the energy tense and confused. Cameras were rolling, press badges swung from necks, and whispered questions slipped between rows like static. But Ariel stood outside the performance doors, eyes locked on her phone screen, reading the anonymous email again and again. We need to talk. It's about the missing roster. I have proof. There was no name, no signature. But attached was a PDF file titled Roster Edit Log Final.ep. Ariel's thumb hovered for only a second before opening it. Her stomach twisted. The document contained a time-stamped list of edits to the competition's final presentation schedule. Edits made from a staff login. Karen's login. One row stood out in black bold font. Remove Monroe. Ariel, finalist sought, done for. Justification. Incomplete documentation. Status. Notified. Notified? Ariel had received no such message. No warning. No disqualification notice. Nothing. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a digital erasure. Intentional. Buried behind bureaucracy. And it might have worked if not for whoever had chosen to break the silence. Ariel inhaled slowly, tucked the phone into her blazer pocket, and stepped forward. The stage assistant from earlier reappeared, just as the first speaker was called up, her walk brisk and voice flustered. She claimed the issue was being addressed, and offered Ariel a seat in the third row just in case there's time later. Her mother, standing just behind her, rejected the offer with a tone that cut through the noise. She is a finalist, and we're not leaving. The room wasn't deaf. Students and parents nearby overheard. A few turned their phones to record. A ripple moved through the crowd. The attention shifted again toward Ariel, this time not as a protester but as the girl in the suit, who was clearly supposed to be on stage, and wasn't. Karen Holloway appeared seconds later, composed on the surface but tight in the jaw. Her steps were slow, deliberate, measured for optics. When Ariel confronted her directly, voice low but unshakable, Karen tilted her head with a smile that never reached her eyes, and replied, "You must have misunderstood. There was a timing issue. These things happen." Ariel didn't blink. She pulled out the printed confirmation email, the one sent by the district just 2 days earlier, listing her presentation time and slot number. She followed it with screenshots of the schedule, time-stamped backups, and media confirmation she'd been included in press communications. The crowd around them began filming. The tension cracked visibly in Karen's face, the smile twitching, eyes scanning the people now standing behind Ariel, with cameras. A district rep, noticing the commotion, hurried over. Ariel handed them the same documents, plus the anonymous PDF. The woman's brows furrowed deeply as she scrolled. She pulled out her phone, stepped aside, and made a call. Karen remained frozen. 5 minutes later, the school board president entered the room. In full view of parents, students, press, and faculty, he walked up to Ariel and offered a public apology. Quiet, but undeniable. He told her she would be reinstated. The audience applauded. Some stood. Karen stepped backward into the wings, but the cost of that delay was immediate. The board had already approved the event's timeline for live broadcast. No changes, no extensions. Ariel's time slot was reduced from 30 minutes to 10 minutes, to deliver the most complex, layered, high-stakes presentation of her life. She nodded once. No protest, no appeal. She simply walked toward the stage, every step echoing through the now silent auditorium. The lights dimmed. The spotlight warmed her skin. She approached the podium. Her hand reached into her blazer and pulled out the USB drive. She had backed it up 10 ways, protected it like it was gold, labeled it clearly. She slid it into the port. The screen behind her lit up, and then went blank. File not found. The folder showed empty. Ariel's chest tightened, but her expression didn't flinch. Her fingers navigated quickly, clicking through hidden folders, backup folders, even checking cloud sync. Still nothing. The presentation she had rebuilt from the ground up, after the first sabotage, after the server deletion, after the score tampering, after being erased from the roster, was gone again. She stared at the glowing void on the screen. She had 10 minutes, and no slides. From the audience, Ariel's mother slowly stands and mouths something toward her daughter. 3 words Ariel can't hear, but the look in her eyes says everything. Do it anyway. Ariel stood beneath the harsh stage lights, staring into a screen that refused to show her truth. Her USB was plugged in, the cursor blinking expectantly, but the folder, the very folder she had poured her soul into, was empty. No slides, no visuals, no data, just the emptiness staring back at her, daring her to break. But she didn't move. The silence in the auditorium began to stretch uncomfortably. The crowd, still electric from the moments leading up to this final round, grew restless. Whispers began. A few phones rose, recording. Somewhere in the back, she knew Karen Holloway was watching, waiting for the moment Ariel would crumble. Maybe this was the last nail in the sabotage. Maybe this was meant to humiliate her right here in front of the people who had finally started to believe in her. Ariel breathed in slowly, her chest rising against the pressure, then stepped away from the computer. If the screen was blank, then she would fill the room with something it couldn't contain. Her voice. She stood center stage, glanced once at the judges, then closed her eyes and began. At first her voice trembled. Not with fear, but with the impossible weight of being forced to fight again. One final time. But her footing steadied as her words took shape. She spoke from memory, not from a rehearsed script, but from the reservoir of lived experience that had been denied and distorted too many times before. She painted her entire project in the air. A detailed breakdown of inequity in public education, the unspoken favoritism embedded in systems pretending to be neutral. She quoted stats by heart, recalling research findings as if they were burned into her skin. She described her interviews with overlooked students and community voices who never made it into official reports. She exposed the policies that looked fair on paper but cut deeper into students who looked like her. And then she turned personal. She spoke of the files erased, the rules rewritten, the threats slid into lockers, the smile Karen wore as she carved obstacles out of red tape. She recalled the smears, the rumors, the silence from people who had once called her friend. She admitted her fear, but never her defeat. Every word was delivered with precision. Calm, bold, soft but sharp enough to leave marks. The auditorium was still. The judges didn't interrupt. The crowd didn't blink. Even the camera stopped flashing as if to preserve the moment untouched. Without slides, her words became the only truth in the room. Without data, her pain became the only evidence. And without permission, she took up space she had been told not to claim. When she reached her final point, Ariel didn't try to prove she deserved to be there. She simply declared it. She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She stood firm and ended with this. I wasn't supposed to be heard today, but I am. And now that you've heard me, you can't pretend you didn't. And then she stepped back. Silence followed. An aching pause that seemed to echo off the auditorium walls. Then a single clap. Then another. Then, as if the air had cracked, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. It wasn't polite applause. It was thunder, roaring, emotional, unfiltered. It shook the walls, surged through the aisles. Even the press dropped their cameras for a second, swept up in the wave. Some people wept. Some screamed her name. Some just stood there, stunned that something so powerful had come from a girl everyone had tried so hard to erase. Karen Holloway didn't appear in the wings. Her silence was louder than any denial she could have offered. But the judges, stoic, polished, shielded, remained seated. They didn't clap. They didn't nod. They simply stared. Ariel stepped down, face unreadable. She had poured everything she had into that stage, and now she waited, again, for a decision made behind closed faces. Time passed. Another student spoke. The final presentations ended, and then the announcement came. Not a winner, but a delay. The MC returned to the mic and informed the crowd. Due to a technical scoring issue, final results will be posted online later this evening. The crowd murmured in confusion. Some questioned. Some rolled their eyes, but Ariel didn't speak. She just sat still, pulse low, staring straight ahead, already knowing she had done everything right, and yet the outcome still hung in limbo, as if fairness was still something optional. Hours later, she received a text from an unknown number. It had a photo attached, a crumpled score sheet pulled from the trash. Her name was circled, first place, and beneath it, in furious red ink, One word had been scrawled: unacceptable. The auditorium's tension hung thick in the air, pulsing on silent breaths and held glances. After the hush following Ariel's raw, uncompromising speech and the murmurs of disbelief among the audience, the culmination of the event felt surreal, as if the stage itself hesitated before surrendering. When the MC's voice cracked back to life, and the judges stood to deliver the final verdict, the room exhaled. Lights narrowed on the panel's table like spotlights on fate. Ariel stood rigid, her heart a contained drumbeat inside her chest. Her mother sat near the front, her face unreadable, eyes fixed on the judges, as though willing them to do what was right. Cameras flashed around the room, but inside time slowed. The head judge cleared his throat and opened the envelope. Paper trembled ever so slightly in his hand. The smallest movement, but enough to make every eye in the auditorium swallow. Ariel felt the weight of that moment in her bones, as though altitude had changed and the ground below shifted. When the announcement came, the word echoed: "We have a tie." A tie between Ariel Monroe and Logan Pierce. Shock rippled first through the bleachers. Some students gasped, some gasped quietly, as though afraid someone might hear their shock. Parents leaned forward, eyebrows knitted low. The judges exchanged calculated looks, their faces calm but their fingers wreathed in the pale light of the desk lamps. In that moment of forced neutrality, the audience held its breath, waiting. Logan Pierce's face flickered with surprise. For half a second, doubt passed across his expression, followed by a flush of uncertainty. Next to him, a flicker of triumph. Soft, improperly timed. Maybe he had expected the tie, or maybe even a win. After all, the path had been paved for him more than once. But what he saw when he turned toward Ariel wasn't relief. It was confusion. He reached for his notes, hesitated, then dropped his hands to his lap. From the crowd came an uneasy silence, as if everyone held their breath waiting for a reaction. Karen Holloway, standing in the back near the exit, allowed a slow, controlled smirk to cross her lips. The kind of smirk that didn't speak victory, but satisfaction. A message. This is how power plays the game. Ariel's chest felt hollow. On paper, the outcome should have stung like defeat. A tie meant no trophy. A tie meant no first place. But beneath the fluorescent lights, beneath the judges' neutral voices, something else began to rise. Something that couldn't be measured by rubrics or score sheets. She stepped forward, not with arrogance or anger, with calmness, with clarity. She met the eyes of every person in the room, from the front row parent clutching a worn "Let Ariel Speak" sign, to the reporter's camera lens, to the distant exit where Karen lingered. She wanted them all to see, this tie was not equality. It was half justice. It was compromise masquerading as fairness. As she walked, murmurs spread. Some whispered regret. Others awkward quiet. A few cameras clicked. Her mother stood and nodded once. Subtle, firm. A wave began, stirring through the crowd. It started near the front with a small clap, then another, then 1,000 hands lifting, rising. The sound built like thunder, swallowing the dim hush of the auditorium. Logan looked at her again, not with triumph, but regret. In his eyes, a whisper of truth. He had known what the competition was. He had known the game was already decided, before the first word was spoken. He turned back toward the judges, his shoulders heavy. Behind him, Karen's smirk shifted, almost a sneer, but even that faltered under the weight of the crowd's rising roar. The audience wasn't cheering for the tie. They were cheering for her, for resilience, for truth, for seeing what had been ignored. Yet the judges remained still, their faces unreadable, pens untouched, notebooks closed. No emotion broke the front. Their neutrality was a wall, a glass barrier. And Ariel understood. This wall was their shield, their way to score beyond sight. When the applause finally died, the empty silence that followed felt both heavy and hollow. The MC's final words floated across the room, formal and soft. Congratulations to our finalists. No declaration of a winner, no first place, just congratulations. Ariel looked down at her hands, trembling lightly. She felt the love, the solidarity, the roar behind her, but also their absence, where it mattered most, on the judge's sheet, on the trophy, on the official record. She realized then that a tie was worse than a defeat. It was an erasure, masked as fairness. Yet inside, something else flickered, not despair but purpose. She would carry this moment. She would carry that roar, not for a trophy, but for truth, for every face in the audience, who had seen, finally, what had always been real. But as the crowd began to file out, a hush spread among a small cluster of parents near the back. They talked quietly, whispers too soft for most to hear, but sharp enough to ripple through Ariel's chest like cold water. The rumor circled, a demand for independent review. A civil rights group now calling on the district to examine the entire process, not for the sake of a trophy, but for accountability. Ariel quietly slipped out of the auditorium with her mother, the roar still echoing in her ears, the weight of unfinished business settling in her bones. Outside, voices rose again, reporters, parents, students. Cameras clicked, phones recorded. The school gates felt smaller than before. The night stretched ahead like a breath waiting to be released. But even in the swirling chaos, one truth stood tall. This tie might have meant no winner, but it had forced the system into the open. And in exposure, there was power. The next morning, the local news ran a headline that felt like a slap across the school's facade: debate controversy. Students demand justice for tied final at Eastwood High. Video clips were everywhere. The final announcement, the crowd's uproar, shots of Ariel standing with dignity, a parent's vocal demand calling for transparency, a reporter's tight-lipped summary. Many feel the tie was not a tie. They believe the competition was manipulated from the start. Social media blew up again. But this time it wasn't whispers. It was a chorus. Alumni posted similar stories. Old debate finalists with questionable wins. Erased black voices. Hushed suspicions finally surfacing. Comments flooded beneath the news links. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Score sheets don't lie, unless someone rewrites them. We backed her when the school would. A hashtag not just a tie began trending across state education forums. Shared by students, activists, parents, and even a few sympathetic teachers. Inside the school district's office, the pressure rose like heat under glass. Emails from parents flooded the inbox labeled compliance requests. Journalists called expecting comments. The district's legal team met behind closed doors. And somewhere in that tension, the previously silent civil rights organization, the same one that had first reached out after the essay leak, released a public statement. We stand with students who speak truth. We call on Eastwood School District to commission an independent audit of the 2025 debate competition judging and scoring process. Transparency is not optional. It is imperative. The statement felt like a match thrown onto dry kindling. Fire spread. School administrators pressed staff for denials. Teachers whispered in empty corridors, shaken out of routine. Parents called board members. Some apologized to Ariel. Some still refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. It fractured the community along old lines. Silence versus exposure. Comfort versus conscience. But in the middle of the storm, a new and unexpected shift happened. One of the judges, not head judge, but a substitute from the community panel, a middle-aged man named Carter Reeves, requested a private meeting with Ariel. Word was he claimed he had witnessed anomalies in the scoring process, but had been overruled. He hinted at wanting to speak out publicly, to join the calls for review. The very person assigned to evaluate debate arguments was offering to evaluate the system. Instead, Ariel knew what that meant. This fight had room for allies, even among those supposed to be neutral, and neutrality, in this moment, was shifting from silence to complicity. Across town, the nonprofit that had first drawn attention to her case announced they would provide legal support. They would subpoena digital logs, interview witnesses, and prepare a formal complaint for the state's Education Oversight Board. For the first time since the competition began, Ariel saw a path not just to vindication, but to systemic change, to a reset of rules that had never treated every student equally. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but with that lift came something heavier: responsibility. Because now the fight was no longer about one competition. It was about every student who might follow. And as she sat at her desk that evening, reviewing the cascade of documents, emails, and media coverage, she realized one stark truth: the tie might have been official, but history would remember what didn't add up. As dusk settled and the school building emptied, Ariel received an unmarked envelope slipped under her front door. Inside was a single slip of paper, a leaked internal memo from the district legal office. In bold type at the top: confidential, plan to replace panel, proceedings must remain private until investigation ends. And at the bottom, in fine print, a name she recognized: Logan Pierce. The morning after the uproar felt heavy, almost sacred. Outside, the sky was gray but still, as if the world sensed the shift and paused. Inside the district office, however, The air crackled, phones ringing, footsteps echoing in hallways, soft voices rushing in and out of doorways. Ariel sat in a small, sterile waiting room, her files spread on the table before her, the leaked trash bin score sheet, the altered official records, the press videos, the crowds, chants, testimonial. Each document carried its own weight, but together they formed something far heavier than any single accusation, a case, a reckoning. She did not speak, she simply watched, quiet, as the district's internal audit team assembled. The investigators worked methodically. They cross-checked timestamps. They compared ink types. They looked for login records. As the cards fell on the table, one after another, the picture became undeniable. The documents showed a pattern. After-hours logins under staff credentials, manual edits on final scores, replacement of original sheets, deletion of backup files, and suppression of alternate score versions, all tied back to the same staff account linked to a faculty member under scrutiny. The forensic audit didn't just confirm tampering, it traced it. Every change, every erased entry, every fabricated justification, logged, dated. The moment the lead auditor closed the final folder and looked up at the small crowd in the room, the tension snapped. No words were needed. The paper trail was the verdict. At that instant, the institution's protective veneer shattered. Word spread fast. The next hours felt unreal. At Eastwood High, inside the faculty lounge, the rumor started as a hushed whisper, then spread like wildfire. Teachers glanced at one another. Administrators shuffled papers. Phones vibrated. The name on everyone's lips was the same: the guilty party. Meanwhile, in the homes of families connected to the competition, shock turned quickly into indignation. The family of the white student, the one favored from the beginning, convened behind closed doors. By evening, a public statement was issued. They withdrew their student's name from the competition. They presented it as a moral stand. We cannot accept a win tainted by unfair methods. On social media, their post was short, almost perfunctory, but the message was loud. The pressure had become unbearable, even for those who once stood comfortably behind the institution's shield. But the biggest blow fell on the institution itself. The district didn't wait. Within 24 hours, they moved swiftly. Suspension of the implicated staff member, mandatory suspension from all school-related teaching duties, initiation of a full review of past competitions, judged under that same legacy panel, and a public apology drafted with careful, regretful language. The letter addressed to the student body admitted procedural failure, unintended bias, and promised reform to ensure equal opportunity for all future participants. For the first time since signing up, Ariel felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, exactly, but validation. The numbers had changed. The robes had faltered. The false fairness had cracked. The truth had surfaced, shiny and undeniable under scrutiny. The media caught wind of the scandal immediately. Local morning news anchors ran segments with somber headlines. High school debate rigged. Student evidence forces district review. Reporters stood in front of Eastwood High's facade. Microphones held steady as former students told stories of subtle betrayals, dismissive comments, and biased judging panels. The leak of the audit results, and the subsequent withdrawal of the favored student made national headlines, not as a high school story anymore, but as a systemic failure echoing larger issues of race, privilege, and institutional injustice. Late that night, Ariel received an unexpected call from a producer of a nationally aired talk show, one that regularly covered stories of civil rights activism in education and youth voices rising against oppression. The request was simple: would she be willing to come on and share her story? Not just the injustice, but the journey, the erasures, the exposures, the fallout, the truth. Her heart pounded as she listened. She thought of all the times she was told to stay quiet. She thought of Karen Holloway's dismissive smirk. She thought of the countless erased files, the broken USB, the silent corridors, the whispered rumors, the threats, and she thought of the thousands now watching, now listening, now believing. She nodded in the quiet of her bedroom, not on camera. It was not about fame. It was about visibility and justice. By dawn, emails started pouring in. Colleges from across the state and beyond reached out. One by one, admissions officers expressed interest, not because of her debate skills, but because of her courage. The combination of academic excellence and activism drew attention. Her grades had always stood out. Now her story did too. And through it all, the teacher who once told her she'd never win, who laughed quietly behind her desk when Ariel signed up, who rearranged rules to her disadvantage, who watched her fight from the shadows. That teacher vanished. No appearances at school. No comments. No public statement, just absence. Shame disguised as silence. But just when it seemed like reckoning had landed its blow, the unexpected appeared again. That night, her phone buzzed with a new email. Subject, National Leadership Award. Congratulations. The body of the email was formal but unmistakably sincere. She had been nominated by the Talk Show's Foundation for a National Youth Leadership Award, a recognition of resilience, activism, and impact, fellowship money, scholarship potential, even media exposure, everything a young activist could dream of. Yet at the bottom of the message, in smaller font, was a condition. By accepting this award, you agree to forgo any pending litigation or public statements regarding the 2025 Eastwood debate case, for the sake of confidentiality. A block of fine print, but a demand nonetheless. A condition that threatened to silence her voice, the same voice that had broken silence so many times before. Ariel stared at the screen. Her chest tightened. The validation she had fought so hard for now dangled before her like an offer. But the price was high. The question loomed. Was the recognition worth the risk of being muted again? She looked out the window into darkness. Outside, the wind stirred leaves across the empty street. Inside, history waited for her choice. Ariel's phone buzzed again. This time the screen lit up with a new notification. Decision deadline 48 hours. Accept or decline. The choice would determine not just her future, but whether the story she began would end in silence or roar. The letter arrived early that morning. It was unsigned, but stamped with the seal of a well-known private foundation tied to several colleges. The subject line glowed in bold. Full ride scholarship offer. The body was polite, formal, praising her resilience, her courage, her outstanding demonstration of leadership and academic merit. It promised tuition, housing, and a stipend, enough to secure her entire undergraduate education. On the surface, it looked like vindication, a ticket to a future many girls like her were told existed only in dreams. But there was a clause, a short paragraph in fine print, a condition that read, by accepting this offer, she agreed not to pursue any legal action or public statements regarding the 2025 Eastwood debate case, and to maintain confidentiality about all internal documents. The generous gift came with a demand for silence. Ariel sat at her bedroom window, the early straps of dawn before sunrise creeping over the horizon. In her lap lay the letter, her reflection in the glass pale and still. Her mother stood quietly nearby, coffee in hand, eyes reading the page over Ariel's shoulder. There was concern there, not anger, not relief, but the heavy weight of uncertainty. Her mother had stood behind her from the beginning, but this risked quieting the truth that had begun to echo far beyond the school walls. Late that night, her brother Miles, now in law school, now the one who had taught her how to rewrite rules into rights, came in with 2 mugs of tea. He didn't look at the letter. Instead, he asked how she felt. Ariel didn't speak for a long moment. She thought of every erased file, every altered score sheet, every whispered threat, every rallying chant, every tearful parent, every phone call, every email, every frightened look in a hallway. She thought of the countless students who would never have the power she had gained, not because of grades or speech, but because the gates had always been locked before they could knock. Miles closed his eyes. He didn't try to persuade her. He only nodded when she finally spoke, quietly, with steel and clarity. She would not sign away her voice. Not for money, not for comfort, not for silence. She would not erase everything she had fought for just because someone offered her gold. It was still early when she logged onto her laptop and began. She typed out an email, not to the foundation, not to the school, but to herself, to future students, a charter for a nonprofit. She named it Voices Forward Initiative. Its mission to support Black and brown students in predominantly white institutions, to document injustice, to provide legal, academic, and emotional support, to transform pain into policy. She sat back as the first draft glowed on her screen, the keystrokes echoing softly in the empty room. She saved it, encrypted it, backed it up on multiple drives. She didn't just reject silence. She built a foundation on defiance. The days that followed blurred together in press interviews, calls from college admissions, messages from students across the state who had read about her story and reached out for advice, solidarity, hope. Her name became more than a headline. It became a symbol of resistance, of resilience. of possibility. The final weeks before graduation were surreal. The same classrooms where she was once whispered about in hallways now felt like stages of a bigger play. Some teachers avoided her gaze, others offered nervous congratulations. Students looked at her differently, not with curiosity but with quiet respect. A few new friendships formed, unexpected alliances with classmates who admitted they had never seen the unfairness before, or had been too scared to speak it aloud. On graduation day, the auditorium doors opened wide, filled with families, cameras, cheers, and hope. Ariel walked in, wearing her cap and gown, heart steady, spine unbent. She spotted her mother near the front, holding her with a proud gaze. Miles was somewhere near the back, paperwork in hand, ready to help with the nonprofit logistics. The energy in the room was different, heavier, but also fuller, larger than before, a mixture of pride, fear, and expectation. When the names were called, she walked onto the stage under lights that felt less harsh now, more forgiving. The principal read the diploma line. Applause rang out, and she accepted the rolled parchment. As she descended the stage steps, the auditorium erupted. First a clap, then another, then a roar that built like a tidal wave, until the chant filled every corner. Ariel, Ariel, Ariel. Her name echoed again, and again, not as a chant for a trophy, but as a claim. She belonged. She had survived. She had won, in more ways than one. But as she stepped into the light, she saw a figure rising from the audience. A white student from her class whom she barely knew. He stood slowly, calm but firm, and he leaned toward his teacher, voice low. Ariel couldn't hear the words, but she caught the movement of his lips, and the expression on his teacher's face shifted. Surprise, apprehension, maybe fear. In that moment, the air around her seemed to still. The chant around her faltered, but the echo remained, because what had begun as a protest, as a fight for fairness, had grown into something more, a question, a possibility, a threat to the old order. The days after graduation were a blur of congratulations, calls, media interviews, and planning meetings. The foundation she had started, Voices Forward Initiative, received its first donations within 40. Emails poured in from students across dozens of districts, some recounting stories not unlike hers, judged unfairly, silenced, sidelined. Others thanked her for opening space, for showing them that refusal to be erased was a valid path forward. Board members volunteered. Lawyers offered pro bono support. A teacher from a nearby school wrote, offering mentorship program. Her scholarship offer letter sat unopened in a file drawer. She left it there on purpose. She didn't destroy it. She didn't sign it. She left it a mark of what could have been. A sign that decisions could be bought. But that choice, she decided, was hers alone. On national television, Ariel appeared as a guest on a talk show that broadcast values of justice, equality, and youth activism. The segment, titled When High School Means Systemic Struggle, featured her not as a victim, but as a changed force, calm, articulate, commanding. She described not just her personal journey, but the systemic patterns she had exposed. She spoke of racism, hidden beneath paperwork, bias masked as rules, the erasures that happened in silence, long before anyone ever heard her name. Her voice was measured, her tone unwavering. When she finished, the studio applauded, but more important than applause was the silence that followed. Viewers across the country were still absorbing what she had said, still reckoning. Universities that had once seemed distant wrote back with interest, not for her debate score, but for her vision, scholarship offers, conditional acceptances, invitations to speak at events about equity and inclusion. Letters piled up. Ariel spent nights reviewing them, thinking not about prestige but about purpose. Which school might best support the nonprofit? Which program would help amplify the voices she'd begun gathering? Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of Eastwood High's faculty lounge, whispers echoed. Administrators spoke in hushed tones. Some tried to justify past decisions. Others looked away ashamed. Karen Holloway was gone, formally dismissed. No retirement, no transfer, no quiet reassignment. Her files were sealed, her credential revoked, her name scrubbed from alumni lists. For the first time, the person who had once told Ariel she'd never win was herself undone by the very system she'd tried to control. The night before Voices Forward's first official board meeting, Ariel sat in her room staring at the stacks of documents, bylaws, mission statements, outreach plans, scholarship funds, legal frameworks. Miles sat beside her, organizing papers. Her mother was downstairs, packing a box of donated books for the nonprofit's first outreach drive. Outside, the wind rustled through trees, quiet, before dawn. Ariel closed her eyes and remembered every moment that led here. The quiet smirk behind the desk, the erased files, the empty slides, the hollow tie, the roar of voices rising in support, the chant at graduation. She thought of every student who had been hushed, every truth buried, every dream deferred. She felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders, heavy, but steady. She exhaled. In the morning, she would walk into the nonprofit's first official meeting. She would speak not only for herself, but for thousands whose names she did not know yet. She would not just survive, she would build. As the dawn light crept across her desk, her phone buzzed. A notification from a private number. She hesitated, thumb hovering, then opened it. The message contained 4 words. "We see you, Ariel." Beyond that, nothing. No name. No signature. Just the words. She allowed herself a small, steady smile. Not of relief, but of readiness. Because now she wasn't asking to be heard. She was demanding to be seen. In a quiet classroom across town, a white student whispers to his teacher, low enough no one else can hear but loud enough to carry power. "What if she runs for president?" The words hang in the air like a challenge, and for the first time, Ariel's fight feels bigger than a competition, bigger than a school, bigger than a singular victory. If you believe voices like Ariel's should never be silenced, type yes in the comments. What would you have done if your name was erased moments before your biggest victory? Don't miss the next story that speaks truth to power. Subscribe to stand with every student who's been told they don't belong. Because the fight against injustice doesn't end. It only gets louder.